chapter 22, and that is Shadows over the Pacific, East Asia under challenge. Particularly, we're going to be talking about China and Japan entering into the early 1900s. And so, first we're going to talk about the decline of the Qing or Manchu dynasty, depending on what you want to call it. They had reached the height of their power in 1800. During this time, China was experiencing a long period of peace and prosperity. They had secure borders, rulers located in the capital at Beijing considered their kingdom the center of the earth, and had good reason to, because they were the oldest civilization. One could argue they were one of the more advanced civilizations in the world, had a bigger navy than any other nation in Europe. But within a century of 1800, they had declined. The Western powers had grown, and the Qing dynasty had stagnated. And so, though this civilization had lasted 2,000 years, they began to decline. Now, historians have long speculated why. Why did they begin to decline? And many have come to assume that the primary reason was intense pressure from Western powers, meaning the competition for spheres of influence in China or trading rights in Japan. However, today many have come to the conclusion that there were many internal changes within the dynasty itself that led to its collapse. Now, really, both explanations have validity to them. Western powers were competing for influence. Great case in point is the 1900 Boxer Rebellion, where Chinese nationalists attempted to dispel foreigners, and the coalition of Western powers sent armed forces to put down this nationalist uprising. Think of it as the American Revolution, except the revolutionaries lost. Now, the Qing dynasty, like the dynasties before it, began to suffer from some of the classic problems of a large, powerful oligarchy. Number one being corruption. When you promote within a family, this creates problems. Number two is civil unrest. Maintaining a strong central power without the consent of the people requires considerable resources to quell revolts. And then finally, incompetence. The Chinese had developed an excellent system of promoting on the basis of merit, but it wasn't always utilized in the top positions, which were often inherited, leading to incompetence. Many of these weaknesses were made worse by a rising population. As we know, during the period we've been discussing, China's population has grown exponentially. In fact, by 1800, China reached a population of 400 million people, without a doubt, the largest country in regards to population. So you could argue, even without the Western powers and without their competition for influence, the Manchus were destined to failure. Now, perhaps we could look at this from a military angle, that European countries like Britain, with the world's strongest navy, using gunpowder cannons, or the United States with its considerable resources, hastened the demise. And yes, certainly so. You could argue that imperialism was a factor, what we spent last week and the last 2 weeks discussing. That Western powers vying for colonial possessions be it in Indochina with France, or the Indies with Great Britain and the Dutch, or Australia, or the Philippines with the United States. That China was being encroached upon. And speaking of imperialism, I would encourage you to read a book on the subject. It's not a textbook, but The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. You can find it online for free. I just got the audiobook on my iPod, and I've been listening to it on my drive since I have a commute. And it's fascinating. It looks at imperialism from the perspective of someone working for one of these imperialist companies, the Belgian in Congo. And it's called The Heart of Darkness because, well, from one perspective, the author is describing the Congo, the darkest parts of Africa, as the darkness of civilization, but it's also talking about the darkness within us that would possess these people to do these terrible things. And from the beginning of the book, he begins to examine why. Why would people do these terrible things to one another? And the only logical conclusion was the efficiency of it. That having an empire produced cheap raw materials, guaranteed markets for their products, and made their companies wealthy. And one of these products that Britain was so delighted in was opium. The opium trade led Great Britain to colonize many different countries, as well as tea. Now, by 1800, Westerners had been in contact with China for over 200 years. But at this time, their arrangements were limited. After several failed attempts to resolve disputes about the tea trade, the British began to ship large amounts of opium to not only their colonies in India, but their spheres of influence in China. Now, of course, I'm sure you know what opium is. A derivative of it is heroin. Opium by itself produces a long-lasting high, which is extremely addictive, and became a staple market for Great Britain to their colonial possessions. Originally, it had been grown in southwestern China, but used only for medicinal purposes. And as Britain began to import this popular drug into China, with its highly addictive properties, I mean, think heroin is a derivative of this, one of the most addictive drugs on the planet. China became obsessed and began importing this from Great Britain. There were attempts to curb this opium trade. For example, Ling Zhe-shu, Chinese official in 1839, was appointed specifically to limit the opium trade. He went directly to the Queen, Queen Victoria at this time. He reasoned with her using both moral and practical arguments. However, as often is the case, the moral arguments failed in light of the chance for commercial profit. Finally, this official attempted blockading the British opium factory in Canton. And as a result, they were punished by the British. The British sent in the military to force open trading rights between China and Britain in regards to opium. So the Chinese found that they were not even allowed to inhibit or prohibit the flow of this illegal drug, not even by the British government. And so this actually triggered a war called the Opium War. Now, the Opium War lasted for 3 years, during which time British warships destroyed most Chinese forts along the coast, and the British fleet was largely undefeated, sailing up the Yangtze and Nanjing rivers. And in the final peace agreement, called the Treaty of Nanjing, the Chinese had to agree to open 5 different coastal ports to British trade. They had to agree to severely limit any taxes on British goods coming into the country. And they actually had to pay for the cost of the war. And this often happens. The loser is forced to pay reparations. This happened to Germany. It actually bankrupted their nation after World War I and was a big cause of why World War II happened in the first place. Now, lastly, is the island nation of Hong Kong. China had to agree to cede the island of Hong Kong to Great Britain. And it was held by Great Britain for 100 years, according to the treaty. Nothing was done about the opium trade, and the opium trade continued unabated. And so this was, you could discuss either a significant British victory or a terrible Chinese defeat. The next rebellion we need to discuss is the Taiping Rebellion. Now, after the Opium Wars, the Qing's failure to deal with problems within their own country caused a major peasant revolt. Now again, this is where you could dispute what is causing this. Is it all internal decline? Is it all Western influence? Really, it's a mixture of both. Because for one, the leader of the uprising, his name is Hong Shi-u-chi-wan. Hong Shi-u-chi-wan. Had actually failed at receiving entrance as a government official. He had failed this civil service exam. He was a convert to Christianity, which was not generally acceptable as a subject of the Qing Empire. Here's where it gets a little weird. He viewed himself as a brother of Jesus, and he hoped to establish a heavenly kingdom, a theocracy, if you will. He called it the heavenly kingdom of supreme peace. This was Hong Shi-u-chi-wan's plan. So again, you could argue it's this Western influence, it's this influx of Christianity that inspired this young man to attempt to start a theocracy and lead a popular uprising in the name of Christianity. But there were also a lot of local causes. Perhaps the number one cause of civil unrest is poverty. Plain and simple. You see, this rapid increase in population wound up forcing millions of peasants to offer their services in exchange for a place to live. This is called sharecropping. You don't own the land you live on. You pay rent in the form of a share of the crops that you produce, and then you live on what you get to keep. Another possible cause was corruption from inside. The fact that taxes continued to go up and the services the government provided continued to go down. Even the Grand Canal, considered the great accomplishment of the Qing dynasty, was promised to bring water to all farmers and irrigate crops in the driest times. It was allowed to silt up, meaning it wasn't properly cleaned and it ceased to work. And so this hindered not only irrigation but also shipment, because ships did travel along this canal. And so the rebellion grew. By 1853, the rebels had seized Nanxing, but the rebellion was finally suppressed by 1864. The rebellion had factioned off, had become divided. By 1864, more than 25 million people had died in this war. Most of them were not even involved in the war. Most of them were civilians. And this point is often lost in teaching about war. You see, as many civilians died in the First World War as soldiers. 7 million soldiers, 7 million civilians, roughly. War doesn't just affect those who sign up. And so finally, with the failure of the rebellion, came the signing of the Treaty of Taiping. Now, one reason that the dynasty failed, because they had difficulty dealing with the civil unrest, the rebellions that were going on, as well as the Western imperialists. I mean, just because they put down this rebellion, 25 million people died. That's not really a success story. I mean, yes, in the American Civil War, the United States remained one great nation. But 500,000 people died. Don't you wish it could have been avoided? Meanwhile, the British and the French, by 1860, were beginning to attack China. The Chinese, the Qing dynasty, had attempted to place restrictions on trade, such as the Opium Wars, had held long prohibitions against missionaries preaching Christianity. And so as punishment, the British came into the mainland of China and went so far as to destroy the imperial summer palace right outside of the capital city of China itself. It's not unlike what the British did to us in 1814. They set fire to the very White House. Did you know that? They burned the White House down in 1814. For much of the very same reasons. Now, in this treaty of Taiping, the Qing were forced to agree to humiliating concessions. They had to formally recognize the opium trade. They had to open additional trading rights for Great Britain. And in fact, they had to give up some of their territories to Russia. Next is the reasons regions, further civil unrest. By the late 1870s, the old Qing dynasty was falling apart. To fend off this rebellion that we discussed, they had to rely on armed forces, which were under command of distinct regions. For example, in the United States, it would be the equivalent of state militias. And after the war, many of these state militias refused to disband. They began to collect their own taxes and began effectively to administer their own regions independently. And so this war, this rebellion, facilitated the decline of a central government. As a result of this, the Chinese court, the central government, began a policy they called self-strengthening. This means that China would open its doors to Western technology, but maintain Chinese culture. Confucian principles would still be intact. The popular slogan used to describe self-strengthening was East for essence, West for practical use. This policy remained in place for over 25 years. One Chinese journalist remarked, and I quote from your book, "The real strength of England lies in the fact that there is a sympathetic understanding between the governed and the governing, a close relationship between the ruler and the people. My observation is that the daily domestic political life of England actually embodies the traditional ideals of our ancient golden age." Not all Chinese court officials were convinced that democracy was the best thing for China. Some, like the court official Shang Shidong, remarked by saying, and I quote, "The doctrine of people's rights will bring us not a single benefit, but 100 evils. Are we going to establish a parliament? Even supposing the confused and clamorous people are assembled in one house, for every one of them who is clear-sighted, there will be 100 others whose vision is beclouded. They will converse at random and talk as if in a dream. What use will it be?" And so many Chinese believed the people were too uneducated to exercise their will correctly in a democracy. And I have to admit, in a social studies class, as a social studies teacher, this is my greatest stress. Will I be able to educate my students to become informed citizens, which is essential for the survival of a democracy? Meaning, can I teach people to think for themselves? Which is why we write papers. Which is why you do forums. Which is why you have to answer these really tricky questions, which require you to think, oh man, there's a couple answers that may be to make those judgment calls about which one's the best. My ultimate goal there, you notice none of it requires memorization, but all of it requires making judgment calls based on the knowledge you have. Because just like the concern of this Chinese court official, my concern as a teacher is that we live in a country where people don't make informed decisions. And it is a really scary thing. And so we get demagogues, people promising us the moon, in exchange for their votes. And if we don't think carefully, we won't make the right decisions. Next, let's go back to talking about imperialism. For the time being, we'll just assume that Zhang Zhidong's arguments came out on top. The Chinese court agreed that the people were not ready for democracy. And in the latter half of the 1800s, the Manchus were preoccupied with reforming their military, modernizing their country, but leaving their culture intact. A great example of this is the construction of railroads, the construction of modern weapons, including rifles, and the training that goes along with operating in military regiments. In the last few years of the 1800s, European nations began to exert their influence more and more. There were pockets of China that were never actually assimilated into Western culture. And some of these, especially north of the Great Wall in the Gobi Desert, had been operating independently for centuries anyway, and were never really part of the Chinese Empire. And as many of these territories began to formally break off from the Qing dynasty, they were often absorbed by default into Russia. Russia at this time had been emerging under the czars, the ruling families at that time, as one of these modern imperialist powers. And their main focus had been their territories to the southeast, such as Korea, such as Manchuria, such as these territories in the Gobi Desert. And competing with them for territories was Great Britain. Now to the south of China, through Southeast Asia, France had been exerting their influence throughout Indochina. The British had been exerting their influence in Burma. And these places had been formally part of the Manchu Qing dynasty. Now also these internal problems. Many of these regional leaders had made separate deals, separate commercial deals, at great profit to themselves with these European nations. As the 1800s were coming to an end, the humiliations of 1897 and the war with Japan, where of course the Japanese soundly defeated the Chinese, forcing them to hand over the Korean Peninsula, which would later result in a war between Japan and Russia, which would later result in a war between the United States and Japan, and would help create the situation that we are in today. So really, why is Korea led by psychos? It goes all the way back to 1897. Speaking of 1897, in that same year, Germany had begun their process of building an empire. In fact, they had the world's second largest navy and one of the world's most powerful militaries. There were 2 German missionaries murdered within China. And Germany was able to use that tragedy to demand territory. It's very much the same case that James Polk used on the Rio Grande when 8 American soldiers were killed in a border skirmish with the Mexican army. And we used that tragedy, which technically happened in Mexico, as grounds to invade and conquer Mexico. The famous phrase was, "American blood on American soil." And here these Germans in righteous indignation were claiming murder of 2 missionaries. That means you have to give us land. Now, the Manchu government was actually still technically in control, though losing much of their influence. And so in 1898, with yet another effort at reform, a young Confucian scholar, cont'd, won the support of the emperor for a comprehensive reform program. This meant reforms to the educational system, this meant a number of real reforms that was set to both change China economically as well as politically. In fact, the communist leader Mao Zedong would point back to this young Confucian scholar as his predecessor. Vladimir Lenin, a contemporary at the time, a young man studying the ways of Karl Marx, who would later lead the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, was eagerly watching this young scholar. Well, the real power at court at the time was the Empress Dowager Shai Shai. She had begun her career as a concubine to the previous emperor, and when that man died, she became the real dominant force, and she managed to have several of these reformers executed. The emperor, in fact, under her command, was put into custody in the palace, and because of this coup that she had led, the attempted reforms came to an end. Now back to foreign pressure. The Open Door Notes were a series of policy statements originated by the U.S. Secretary of State John Hay at the time. Number one, it was arguing that China should maintain an open door or open trading rights with all European nations. And meanwhile, this gentleman's agreement meant that the United States would begin to limit immigration of Asian immigrants. They went so far as to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States, prohibiting immigration of Chinese immigrants. And then in Japan with the, quote, gentleman's agreement, the agreement to limit immigration. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Boxer Rebellion. The purpose of the open door was as much an agreement for the European powers as it was for China. The idea was that we should not compete for commercial influence, but that we should trade freely. The Chinese didn't see it that way, though. And many believed they were losing their sense of identity. Religiously, many Chinese were beginning to convert to Christianity. Culturally, many were beginning to adopt Western styles of dress, speaking in Western languages, and using Western products. Now, the Boxers were a secret society. They were called such because of the particular martial art they studied, very similar to Tai Chi, resembles American boxing. And provoked by a drought, high poverty, high unemployment, many of which had been caused by foreign activity, such as the introduction of railroads, the use of steamships, and all these things undercut the livelihood of many workers that had been relying on the previous system of transportation of goods. And so because of this, the Boxers began to attack foreigners living throughout the country. They even began to surround various foreign embassies. And so as punishment, a U.S.-led joint coalition of many different nations violently quelled the Boxer Rebellion. We're finally getting to the point where we can talk about the collapse of the Qing dynasty. Again, the dynasty kept trying to reform itself, hoping to remain in power. The Empress Dowager had willingly accepted a number of reforms. The civil service system was replaced by a Western-influenced educational system. You see, even though the civil service system is neat, a merit-based hiring system for government officials with no real public education, the only people who could afford the education which would allow them to pass the test were the very wealthy. And so all the civil service system managed to do was ensure that the very wealthy maintained these high important positions. And so one big reform was a system of public education. By 1905, a commission had been formed to study possible constitutional changes, steps towards democracy such as a democratically elected legislative assembly, both at the local and even by the national level, by 1910. These were moves in the right direction. But if history teaches us anything about an empire or dynasty trying to remain in control when a powerful, despotic government system attempts to take cautious steps towards democracy and reform itself, that's often the beginning of the end. Think of the Soviet Union. When Mikhail Gorbachev announced, and this was before your time, I was very young, but when he announced that the Soviet Union would allow free speech and allow each province within itself to decide, do they want to remain a part of the Soviet Union or would they like to freely, safely break away? These were called perestroika for restructuring and glasnost for opening. They allowed the freedom of the press, the freedom of the Russian people to begin to openly criticize the Soviet government. Within a decade, within a few years in fact, the Soviet Union no longer existed. The communist system collapsed. And so again, that's a modern example. But we've seen this time and time again. Such was the case in China. Also importantly, these reforms meant little for peasants. because the majority of the Chinese people had only seen higher levels of poverty coupled with higher taxes. And of course, that leads to resentment. So, the first real physical manifestations of a true revolution occurred in the very end of the 1800s. And the movement was called the Revive China Society, led by a radical young man, Yat-sen. He had been educated in Hawaii, which by this time was a territory of the United States. And so he had been exposed to Western ideas and cultures. And while there, he had studied medicine. And as he returned to China to practice, he began to notice there was more than just medical problems wrong with his country. There were some real social problems that needed addressing. By 1905, he had managed to unite groups all throughout China. His program was called the Three People's Principles. First being the elimination of Manchu rule. Second being the adoption of a democratic government system. And third being an improvement in the livelihood of the average Chinese person. The first part of this process required a military takeover. But the hopeful end was that it would lead to a constitutional democracy. The movement was actually extremely popular because by this time, in fact, by October of 1911, called the Revolution of 1911, beginning in Wuhan, an industrial center of central China, Sun's followers launched an uprising. Now, during this revolution, Sun traveled back to the United States. And even though he was not present during the revolution, this caused the dynasty to begin to collapse. The Empress Dowager passed away in 1908, and the last emperor of the Qing dynasty was an infant named Puyi. P-U-Y-I. I can't pronounce that. Now, though Sun's party lacked perhaps real organization or the resources and military strength of the Qing dynasty, and because of these shortcomings, they were unable to truly reform and revolutionize society. They were forced to turn to many representatives from the old order, such as the military general Yuan Shikai. Yuan was put in charge, originally, of the imperial forces. He was ordered to suppress the rebellion, but he actually wound up joining the rebellion. And he agreed to serve as the president of the new Chinese Republic. So though there were still these elements of the old order, such as this general, the old dynasty was gone. And although this does represent real change, because there was a real change in power, this program, the three-step program that Sun had prescribed, based on Western ideas aimed at improving a Chinese middle class was perhaps a bit too radical. Because at this time, the Chinese middle class was very poor. There were many, very small. There were many poor Chinese. There were very few extremely wealthy Chinese. But there weren't a whole lot of people in the middle that would have really benefited from this. You see, the vast majority of Chinese people at this time were still subsistence farmers, still living off the land, what they could grow in a year. And so, because of this, few peasants actually did not join the rebellion. Few peasants chose to take part in this. Why? Because they didn't have any real buy-in. It was difficult to convince the very poor because the revolution was really going to benefit those who already had some wealth. And so, what China was experiencing was not uncommon. In fact, many monarchies and dynasties were collapsing at this time around the world, both in Western Europe. Think about the Ottoman Empire. Think about Germany's collapse following the First World War. Think about the collapse of many states, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And so many dynasties and regimes were coming to an end. And many of them came to an end not long after the collapse of the Qing dynasty. For example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist. And all of these paid the supreme price. And World War I will be the real kind of moment of change for many of these powers that we'll discuss. Now let's talk about the transition of Chinese society. Because throughout the collapse of the Qing dynasty, Western influence continued to grow and had a major impact. Now, for one, a big reason that China had suffered such a loss culturally from Western incursion was that they themselves were not organized. There was not a great deal of commercial infrastructure. And so this made it difficult for China to Westernize, even had they wanted to. You see, China was in the midst of undergoing an industrial revolution to a small degree. But largely, most Chinese people were still farming, still living off the land. And so the process of industrializing was going very slowly. For one, China had no uniform system of weights and measurements. They had no real banking system. They were not using paper money yet. They had no real centralized transportation system. There were very few paved roads. And so perhaps because of these things, the Chinese people maybe couldn't even afford the degree of Western technology that they might have had they had a more stable economic infrastructure. For one, if they didn't have the technology or the capital to invest in it for themselves, they were unwilling to allow foreign manufacturing companies to operate. Often, Chinese attempts to emulate Western technologies such as weapons or shipbuilding were controlled by the government and suffered usually from mismanagement. The increase in population had severe consequences. For example, rice, the staple diet in China, was increasingly being replaced by less nutritious foods. And this led to soil depletion. And much of the arable land was already under considerable strain because of the amount of people eating. Meaning that because there were so many people eating off the farms, farmers needed to grow more food, exhausting the soil and making problems worse. Some farmers benefited from switching to commercial agriculture. But the next problem I want to discuss is complacency at the top, incompetence. You see, the court, the Chinese court that is, had been hesitant to deal with these obstacles, such as the immense poverty of the Chinese people or the encroaching Western influence. The Qing officials often seemed overwhelmed by these two great crises, that is, the rampant poverty and the Western encroachment. While other nations were attempting to modernize, the Manchu court often exhibited true complacency, meaning an unwillingness to modernize. Next, we have to consider the impact of imperialism. Perhaps one positive, we spent a lot of last week discussing the negatives of imperialism, but one possible positive is that it forced China and these other nations to become integrated with a world economy. Which leads us to the question of whether China would have experienced an industrial revolution had Western Europe not gotten involved. Not everyone agrees, though. In fact, the Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, argued that Western imperialists hindered real change by using their colonies to maintain markets for Western manufactured goods, sources of raw materials, and cheap labor. So the communists were arguing that the imperialists, the Western imperialists, were intentionally keeping the pre-industrial countries down. In fact, Mao Zedong, the eventual leader of the Chinese Communist Revolution, claimed that had the West not intervened, China would have found its own road to modernization. Now, many historians today claim that by shaking China out of its traditional mindset, imperialism did benefit, if nothing else, by leading to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. However, the economic toll was heavy. Of course, again, with the poverty. And that's about all we have. So today we'll be talking about daily life in Qing China, under the Qing dynasty. We're going to be looking at daily life in the 1800s. Now, for most Chinese people, it was not substantially different than what daily life had been centuries prior. Most people were still farmers, and their lives were still governed by the harvest cycle, living in rural communities, and still focused around family culture. Chinese roles in society had changed very little over the centuries, still following the principles set aside in Confucianism. Male children were typically the only ones who were educated. In rare cases, female children were able to gain access to an education. Typically, females remained at the home. That cult of domesticity that we talked about in American history is very prevalent in Chinese society as well. All children, meanwhile, were expected to obey their elders, and certainly wives were expected to be submissive to their husbands. However, from 1800 through until the 20th century, there are some profound changes that occur that we're going to be talking about. Number one, if you look at the coastal cities in China, where the most communication with the outside world is going on, as well as where most of the educated and wealthy people are going to be living, that's where often we're going to see some of the most striking changes. These ancient social institutions, such as Confucianism, began to decline in importance, and more European cultures began to find their way into Chinese society. For example, many Chinese people around the 1800s began to wear suits, began to dress in Western styles, and some even began to practice Christianity. And so this trend towards European or Western ways is going to become prevalent in China, especially in the coastal cities. One of the aspects of this could be seen in the decline of Confucian education. Some of these changes could be traced to the educational system. For example, throughout the 1800s, the importance of Confucianism as seen in Chinese schools did tend to decline. For example, almost half of the degree holders by the mid-1800s actually purchased their degrees. The idea of Confucianism was that the most able, the most brilliant, the most talented people would go into important government positions. But we do begin to see aspects of corruption where the wealthy could purchase positions of influence. Now, after around 1906, the government abolished the civil service examination system altogether. The purpose of the civil service examination system was to ensure, again, the most qualified people through a standardized test. For example, a certification exam that you would have to take to prove that you're qualified to do a certain job. Western-style education became increasingly desirable. Now, the ruling powers at that time did attempt to establish an educational system entirely on the Western model, based on the idea of universal elementary education. You see, the civil service system relied on one's individual desire and motivation to advance themselves through their career. And so not everyone went to school, not everyone was encouraged to school, and school was really only meant for those who truly, truly wanted it. But the Western style was very different. The idea that democracy relies on an educated electorate. And so China did begin to move in that direction. We also see some changing roles for women. Perhaps one of the most visible, lasting traditions was foot binding. Now, we do see the practice of foot binding on the decline throughout the 1800s. Less and less Chinese women are binding their feet. It's a barbaric practice where from a very young age, a Chinese girl's feet would be tied into a shape. And as their feet would grow, their bones would break, and it would eventually form a lotus shape like this. It was based on a Chinese standard of beauty, but it's a very cruel and barbaric practice that over the course of a girl's life, her feet would break as they would grow until they would go into this shape right here. It's rarely practiced today. It was still in practice throughout the 1800s, but we do see a decline. Roles in factories and rebellions. During the second half of the century, we do begin to see some signs of change. For example, we see some women seeking employment in factories. most notably in the textile industry. Some women did participate in the Boxer movement, which was a Chinese nationalist movement meant to rid the country of foreign influences. We did see some women participate in that, and some even fought beside men in various political revolutions, like the one in 1911. We also see throughout the early 20th century some female writers. For example, a well-known female revolutionary wrote a manifesto calling for women's liberation and greater women's rights in Chinese society. Now, by the end of the century, educational opportunities for women began to appear for the first time. For example, some of these were in Christian missions, where Western missionaries would go to China to teach Christianity, but they would also establish schools, and these were some of the first schools that admitted women. And although in the beginning only a small number of women were admitted to these schools, it does have a significant impact as more women were able to gain access to public education. And eventually, throughout the 20th century, the government began to discourage foot binding and pass laws to prevent it. Okay, and now let's move on to talking about Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate was the beginning of Japanese nationalism. While the 1800s were beginning, the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled the country as a unified nation for almost 200 years. They had revitalized the government system, which under their predecessors in the time of the warring states in Japan, a central form of government had eventually disintegrated. And so the Tokugawa shogunate, if nothing else, were able to reestablish a central government. They had driven out foreign traders and missionaries and generally reduced their contacts with the Western world. Meanwhile, the Tokugawa maintained formal relations only with Korea, yet they did allow informal commercial operations with a few other European countries, most notably the Dutch, and then some Chinese merchants. Generally, Japan considered themselves isolated, an insular community. They did not want other countries influencing their culture. However, though they were isolated, they certainly weren't stagnant, meaning that they did continue to advance technologically and did continue to grow in sophistication as a people. Though the vast majority of the Japanese, like the Chinese, still depended on agriculture for their livelihood, throughout the 1800s, Japan was also undergoing an industrial revolution. As a result of this revolution, Japanese society began to see deep changes. For example, class distinctions were becoming blurred. People were able to experience social mobility. Industrialization did allow a poor person to advance themselves in society in a way that an agrarian rural culture might not. Some speculate that the Tokugawa system was beginning to come apart just as the feudal system in Europe had started to disintegrate around the beginning of the Renaissance. And really there are parallels between Japanese industrialism and modernism and what was going on in Western Europe around the same time. For example, we still see, though the Tokugawa shogunate represented a central government, we still do see factionalism, meaning warring and rival tribes and different groups fighting against one another. In times of bad harvest, through drought or famine, farmers would come to the towns where there were more opportunities. And as the samurai became less relevant because Japan was modernizing, Many samurai actually lashed out and began to consider themselves outsiders of the government. For example, in response to the samurai becoming increasingly critical of the modernization of Japanese society, the Japanese government, the Tokugawa shogunate, the Bakufu, became increasingly rigid, and they began to persecute their critics, and this forced many, not only of the samurai but also the peasants as well, to flee out of the cities. And I know it's fictional, but the movie The Last Samurai does go into that somewhat, of how Japan was modernizing, samurai were becoming irrelevant, and their practices and ways were even becoming not taboo, but just out of favor, I suppose. And so they took to the countryside. Japan, however, though it was modernizing, continued to remain isolationist. The government intensified efforts to limit contacts with the outside world. In fact, they would often prohibit foreign ships from landing in their harbors. Japan financed most of its imports in silk from other countries in Asia, and they would pay for these items through output from their own silver, gold, or copper mines. Eventually, their ability to extract resources within their own country became less abundant. Japan is a land of many different islands. In fact, there's very little farmland in the many islands of Japan. And so they've often had to rely on the sea for much of their food. It's why so many Japanese dishes are based in seafood. But also they've had to rely on tidewater types of crops like rice, because so little of their land is suitable for farming. And we're seeing the same problem here with mining. For a time, they were able to rely on producing enough precious metals to trade with other countries. But since their resources were so scarce, Japan did have to develop a somewhat more of an aggressive culture. For example, the Tokugawa shogunate sought to adopt a policy of sakoku, closing off their country altogether, even toward the Asian neighbors, as a result of a cutback on foreign trade. Now, perhaps most significantly in opening up Japan to the world is a man named Commodore Perry. To the Western powers, Japan's refusal to open its doors to Western goods was a challenge, because Japan did represent a huge potential market, and they did have items, raw materials, goods that Western nations could exploit and use for their profit. And many Western powers were convinced that the Japanese expansion of trade would be a benefit to everyone. And so not only the United States, but many other Western nations began to approach Japan in the hope of opening up their kingdom. Now, the first to succeed in establishing a permanent trading relation with Japan was Great Britain. So American steamships, meanwhile, had been crossing the northern Pacific. Ever since the early 1800s, we began to colonize the West Coast. Even before it was a part of America, we had settlements at Fort Clatsop in Oregon, and we had settlements in San Francisco in what is today California. And so American steamships had been leaving from these harbors, doing business with Japan. But then in 1853, 4 American warships arrived in the major Japanese harbor of Edo Bay. With them, they carried a message from the president, who was at this time Millard Fillmore, and he requested an opening of foreign relations between the two countries. They were turned away. And so a few months later, Commodore Perry returned with an even larger fleet, waiting for an answer. While the first fleet returned home, preparing for the second arrival, Japanese officials were debating this issue. Should Japan open its borders? Should they begin to trade with other countries? Some argued the context with the West would be a disadvantage to Japan. Politically, in the fact that they feared a loss of sovereignty like the African countries had experienced under imperialism. Culturally, they feared a watering down of their culture. The Japanese people considered themselves very insular. They considered their culture very ancient, and they did not want their people to change. They saw what happened at the Boxer Rebellion. They saw how many Chinese people were beginning to adopt Western styles, and many did not want to see that in their country. Now, for the leadership in Edo, which is the capital of Japan, Perry's ships eventually proved decisive. I mean, he showed up the first time with 4 warships. They turned him away. He showed up again with a large fleet, and that did prove to be the deciding point, just a simple display of American military power. And so the Japanese agreed to the Treaty of Kanagawa, and this provided for the return of shipwrecked American sailors, the opening of ports for trade with the United States, and finally the establishment of a permanent U.S. consulate in Japan. And this is where diplomats could open up political relations with Japan. Now, in 1858, U.S. Consul Townsend Harris negotiated a more formal commercial treaty, and this called for the opening of more ports, the exchange of foreign ministers, and finally the granting of privileges for U.S. residents in Japan. And so with this agreement, people could formally and safely move to Japan, retain their U.S. citizenship, and live there as permanent residents. Okay, now the opening of relations with Westerners was very unpopular. The Japanese viewed everyone else in the world as barbarians, everyone as outsiders. They had still do, a strong sense of nationalism. And so the opening of their country was a very unpopular decision to many, particularly in regions that were in the countryside, far away from the capital. So resistance was especially strong in some of the southern territories, such as Satsuma and Kyushu. Both of these have strong militaristic traditions. And so the shogun, or leader of Japan, eventually backed down from the agreement. And so soon these rebels do find themselves in conflict with the main Tokugawa shogunate. And so we see the beginnings of a civil war briefly. And so this is the incident that the movie The Last Samurai was based on, where we do see a group of samurai rebel against the shogunate in the name of their emperor. And this rebellion, though it was a failure, it did reinforce the sense of antagonism towards the West. It did convince the Japanese that they needed to build up a standing army. And after having done so, they demanded that the shogun resign, and they renewed their attacks until finally the shogunate system came to an end altogether. So though it took several years, the samurai did eventually win a restoration of power for the emperor and a return to some of their old ways. Now we're going to talk about the Meiji Restoration. And I had to look it up. That's how you say it, Meiji Restoration. Now, although the victory of the samurai faction known as the Satcho appeared to be a triumph over change, the new leaders, now that the shogunate has stepped down, also realized that Japan would have to adapt in order to survive. Now, embarking on a system of reform would eventually transform Japan into an industrial power. Now, the symbol of this era was the emperor himself. He had taken on the name of Meiji upon ascending the throne in 1867. And although this was a period that was supposed to be a period of unification with the emperor as the symbolic head, that was supposed to be more modernist. It was actually controlled by leadership just as the shogun, in very much the same fashion. And so while the emperor ruled, he really ruled as a figurehead where the actual system of government had changed very little. The new capital, though, is located at Edo, and the imperial court was moved to the shogun's palace near the center of the city. Now, the daimyo eventually are going to see their power abolished, and this is around 1871. These new leaders of this new Meiji Restoration launched a comprehensive reform of Japanese political, economic, and cultural institutions. They had moved to abolish the remnants of the old order and to strengthen the executive power in their hands. And so to undercut the power of the daimyo, which were essentially like feudal lords, hereditary privileges were abolished. And so one of the ways that the daimyo were able to maintain power for so long is that they passed down their lands and titles, father to son, generation to generation. And so when that was abolished in 1871, many of these lords lost rights to their own lands. But as compensation, they were given wealth from the government in the form of bonds. And they were named governors of territories subject to the will of the emperor. The samurai, meanwhile, comprised about 8% of the total population. And they eventually did receive payment as well to replace their traditional stipends. But they were forbidden to wear the sword. And this had been the symbol of their status. Because by the 1860s, the sword was becoming obsolete as a tool in war. And it was quickly being replaced by the gun. The story of the samurai rebellion that led to the downfall of the Tokugawa shogunate, we do see some of these samurai clans actually rejecting use of the gun in favor of the sword. And so again, that's what the movie was based on, where you have these samurai fighting in the old tradition versus regular soldiers with rifles. Now, the Meiji modernizers set out to create a political system based on the Western model. For example, the Charter Oath of 1868, Japan promised to create a new democratically elected assembly, and yet it would operate in the same way as the former imperial rule. But the purpose of it was that some of the lawmaking process would become democratic. They also called for an elimination of, quote, evil customs, and these were meant to reform practices to, quote, strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. For example, the key posts in the new government were dominated by certain samurai known as the Genro, or some of the elderly statesmen who had been politicians for many years. And so over the next 20 years, the Meiji government undertook a study of Western political systems. They sent a commission to several different European countries, such as Great Britain, Germany, Russia, and even the United States. And so we do begin to see Western influences in Japan. For example, there was a liberal and progressive party. Several groups began to focus on these liberal ideas of civil rights and democracy and equality. And the Liberal Party favored a model that would take supreme authority away from these old daimyos and shoguns and emperors and put that lawmaking power into a democratically elected parliament, much like Western Europe had already done. And then you have the Progressive Party also, which called for a distribution of power between the legislative and executive branches in kind of a nod to the American style of government. Now, Japan did eventually adopt a constitution in 1890. And while this was being adopted, and while these factions were competing for influence, the Progressive Party did emerge victorious. The Meiji Constitution was formally adopted in 1890, and it was based off the German model, where supreme authority would be vested in the executive branch, and that the Constitution would be a gift of the emperor to the people. And so, while there would be a constitution with a clear statement of rights for Japanese people, the emperor would retain executive authority. The Meiji oligarchs, this was the old ruling powers, would be the ones to handpick the cabinet, and the upper house of the parliament would be appointed, meaning that senators would not be elected directly by the people. And to be fair, the senators weren't elected by the people in the United States until the 17th Amendment was passed in the late 1800s. So as far as democracy goes, Japan's model wasn't too far off from what America had at this time. Now let's talk about the ideology of kokutai. The core ideology of the state was called kokutai. Translated roughly, this is national polity or policy. This was embodied by the concept of uniqueness in the Japanese system, that kokutai would be based on the supreme authority of the emperor. The practice of Shinto, which was the Japanese national religion, was transformed into not just a religious practice, but an expression of national loyalty. That traditional ceremonies would be performed at all public events. And so this would become the official national religion of the new Japanese state. The result was a system that was democratic in form, but in practice, you could call it rather despotic, because the emperor retained executive authority, supreme power. There was a legislative, but the only democratically elected group in the country was the lower House of Representatives. Think of the House of Representatives in Congress. And so in practice, this Shinto, this national religion, was meant to be a means of social control by the conservatives, and that the oligarchy, or the real ruling powers in Japan, held most of the power. And so this system permitted the ruling class to retain its influence and economic power while appearing to acquiesce to these new ideals that we've talked about. And now let's talk about economics in Japan. While the daimyo declined in influence and the feudal system was on the decline, the government needed a new system of land ownership that would transform the rural population. Since most Japanese people were still peasants living on farms, how do we get those people to pay taxes? And so to make this work, the Japanese government enacted a land reform program. This would redefine lands parceled into private property, and this would compensate the previous owners, or the daimyo, or lords, with government bonds, giving them a deal of wealth and influence and power. Yet, while the Japanese people individually owned their land, just like we now own our land, or rent it, or reside on it, or whatever, but the point is that individuals can own property in Japan now. With that comes a land tax. It would be at an annual rate of 3% of the value of the land, and that would be paid each year, and this would be imposed to raise revenue for the government. The tax proved to be an effective source of income for the government. So the property tax turned out to be a good idea. However, for the farmers who had previously paid a percentage of their harvest, not a percentage of the value of their land, this did prove to be burdensome. And so economically, while owning your own land is great and awesome in theory, it actually proved to be more expensive than just paying rent in the form of crops. Just like owning our land here is obviously the way to go if you can afford a mortgage, but it's certainly more expensive than paying rent. And that's what many Japanese farmers had to find out the hard way. For example, in bad years, many peasants who relied on farming would find it very difficult to pay their taxes. and would sometimes even be forced to sell their lands to Western neighbors at a loss. For example, if my wife or I lost our job, we'd be forced to find a new one. Say we couldn't find a new one. We'd be forced to sell our house. Jeter Mountain homes don't sell too quick. It'd sit on the market for a year or two if we wanted the price that we needed. If we needed to sell it quickly, we would lose big time. And by losing, that means that we would sell it and still owe money, which is not good. And that's what many farmers found themselves in as new owners of property. Eventually, the government reduced the tax rate, and still, by the end of the century, around 40% of the farmers were tenants, meaning they didn't actually own the land. Either they'd had a bad year and had to sell it, or they could never afford to own the land in the first place. So about 40% of farmers, or 40% of the rural population, were still renting and not buying. Now, industrialization. While the government found a reliable form of revenue, they then turned to the promotion of industry. The objective here was to guarantee Japan's survival against the challenges of Western imperialism. What didn't work for Africa? The problem with Africa was that they had not developed enough of an industrial society to keep up with the rapid growth in Western Europe. And so Western Europe was able to sell finished products to Africa at great profit while buying raw materials. It was the same setup we saw in the American colonies. And Japan hoped to prevent that trade deficit of trading raw materials and buying and importing more expensive finished products. Japan hoped to prevent that by industrializing themselves. Now, building on the small but growing industrial economy that existed under the Tokugawa shogunate, the major reformers provided a major stimulus in the form of financial subsidies, foreign advisors, improved transport and communications, universal education system, applied science, everything towards the end of helping Japan's industries to flourish. Unlike China, Japan was able to rely very little on foreign investments, and they had enough wealth within their own country that they were able to finance much of their own industrial growth. During the late Meiji era, Japan's industrial sector began to grow. The tea and silk industries remained two of the key industries, two of the bedrock industries in their country, biggest employers, biggest revenue generators, etc. But these key industries also came to, by the end of the Meiji era, to include weapon production, ship building, and of course sake, or fermented rice. Now, from the start, the distinctive feature of the Meiji model was an intimate relationship between the government and private business, where one could almost say that private business was influential in the government to a detriment. One could also say that of our country. But once an individual enterprise or industry was on its feet and doing well, it was turned over entirely to private ownership, though the government may continue to play a significant role or continue to finance or subsidize that industry if it needed it. Now, one historian explained this process well, and I quote, "The Meiji government pioneered many industrial fields and sponsored the development of others, attempting to cajole businessmen into new and risky kinds of endeavor, helping assemble the necessary capital, forcing weak companies to merge into stronger units, and providing private entrepreneurs with the aid and the privileges of a sort that would be corrupt favoritism today. All this was keeping in with the Tokugawa traditions that business operated under the tolerance and patience of the government. Some of the political leaders even played a dual role in politics and business." So while we call that corruption today, business and government so closely intertwined, that was viewed as the ideal of Japanese culture at that time. Now, from a worker's perspective, we hear close relationship between business and the government. And we start to think, Business telling the government what to do. We start to think money controlling politics. You start to get angry and upset. So from a worker's perspective, perhaps this was a little less attractive. For example, industrial growth was subsidized by funds provided from taxes on the poor. So you could argue, and you could make a strong point, that in the Japanese industrial era, the poor were financing the wealthy through taxes and then subsidies and tax breaks. And these taxes imposed severe hardships on the poor, many of whom were peasants, many of whom had left cities, and many of whom wound up having to go back to cities to find better jobs because farming wasn't going to be lucrative enough. And so they wound up providing an abundant source of cheap labor. Now we see the same story in America and Europe during the Industrial Revolution, where farmers couldn't make a living as farming grew industrialized and larger businesses took over farming, and more people moved to the cities. And since so many people were in the cities looking for work, and there were very few laws protecting workers, in Japan there were almost none, then they were paid very poorly. Workers in the Industrial Revolution tended to work long hours in dangerous conditions and often died early as a result. In some cases in China, if coal miners or other workers tried to escape or leave their workplaces, they could be shot. Okay. And so now we're going to talk about the social structure of Japan as they modernized. By the late Tokugawa era, the old social order was beginning to disintegrate. The wealthy could now buy their way into ranks that you once had to be born into. For example, the samurai was once an inherited title, and now someone could buy the title of a samurai. And more people were abandoning their fields and moving to cities looking for work. Yet, community and rigid hierarchy were still the basis of society. And so old feudalism was very, very slow to die. Japanese lives were still determined by their membership in various organizations. Of course, like Confucianism, the family was still considered the most basic element, but also membership in their village or membership in their social class. And so membership of a particular social class determined the types of jobs that one would have access to, as well as the types of social relationships, the friends, those they might wind up marrying or being related to. Women in particular were constrained by a cultural phenomenon known as the three obediences, and that is a child loyal to the father, a wife loyal to the husband, and a widow loyal to the son. I'll never forget asking my mom what it meant that the Bible pointed out that a son was to care for his mother and to become the head of the household if the father is to pass. And I was like, "What does that mean? I'm in charge of you, that I can now tell you what to do?" And she was like, "Oh, no, she wasn't okay with that." But that was the way of life in Japanese society at that time. Husbands could easily obtain a divorce, but wives could not. Allegedly, a husband could divorce his wife for any number of reasons. A couple of examples that your book gives. A husband could divorce his wife if she talked too much, if she drank too much tea. I mean, the point is that a husband could divorce his wife for almost any reason, but a wife did not have the same freedom. Now, marriages were arranged, and typically the average age for a female to marry was 16. I mean, can you imagine how your life would have been different if you'd married at 16? I mean, I probably wouldn't have continued my education, and I certainly wouldn't be here now. Females did not share inheritance rights with males. Very few had access to education outside the family. Now, reformers, the Meiji reformers, are going to set out to destroy much of this traditionally rigid social system. For example, with the abolition of hereditary rights in 1871, it did bring many of these legal restrictions to an end. Special privileges for the aristocracy were abolished, and legal restrictions on the ita, that is the traditional slave class. There were roughly 400,000 slaves in 1870 in Japan. And so eventually that practice of slavery was abolished, but it was a little later than the United States. Another key focus of the reform was the construction of a large standing army. For example, the Sacho reformers were struck by the weakness of Japanese forces when Western powers sought out to create a military that could compete in the modern world. And so the Japanese did actually bring in Western military advisors to train their armies for modern combat, because the old feudal way of fighting, with reliance on the skilled warrior class of the samurai, was obsolete, because a sword was no longer effective against a gun, not in mass combat, that is. And so the new imperial army would be based around conscription. And so again, The Last Samurai does have elements of history within it. How you have the imperial army of conscripts or draftees versus the samurai, these old skilled warriors. Education also underwent a lot of major changes. For example, the need for universal education was finally recognized. And this did include technical subjects such as math and science. The Meiji leaders adopted the American model of a three-tiered system of education culminating in universities or specialized institutions. They would send their best and brightest to study in other countries, and they would bring and invite foreign scholars to Japan to teach in these schools, where much of the content was inspired by Western models. Women were also given an opportunity for the first time to get an education. Now, these changes were included in the Imperial Rescript on Education. This was issued in 1890. And this emphasized the traditional Confucian virtues of loyalty to the family and loyalty to the state. And so the main reason this rescript was issued was the concern that Japan's infatuation with Western ideas might be a detriment to their culture and community. Western ideas and fashions had become the rage. Japan had become infatuated with Western culture at that time. For example, the ministers in the first Meiji government were known as the, quote, dancing cabinet because they loved ballroom dances, and that was their typical social event of the wealthy at that time. Young people began to dress in Western styles, began to eat Western foods, and began to behave in Western ways. And so let's talk about the conflict or contrast of traditional values and women's rights. Nevertheless, this transformation of Japan into a, quote, modern society certainly didn't change its centuries-old traditions. Although an educational order in 1872 increased the percentage of Japanese women exposed to education, conservatives soon began to impose restrictions and encourage a return to more traditional social relationships. For example, the rescript that we talked about stressed these Confucian ideas of loyalty to family, loyalty to country, and loyalty to community. Loyalty above individualism. Traditional values were given a firm legal basis in this new constitution. In fact, it restricted private enterprise to men, meaning the ownership of businesses. It defined individual liberties as, quote, subject to limitations imposed by law, meaning that there were no guaranteed civil rights like we had in the Bill of Rights. And also the Civil Code of 1898, again, placed a lower value on individual rights and even treated women within the context of their role within the family. So women were not even legally viewed as individuals, but as members of their family. Yet, practically, women began to enter the factory and to work. By the end of the 1800s, changes were underway as women began to play a crucial role in the nation's effort to modernize. In many cases, it was out of necessity. The women needed to work to supplement their family's income, and the government encouraged women to fulfill their patriotic duty. And so young girls actually went to work in large numbers, particularly in the textile mills. In fact, women represented about 60% of the Japanese labor force, and thanks to them, by 1914, Japan was the leading exporter in the world of silk, and dominated by 1914 cotton manufacturing. In fact, Japan's industrial growth was part of the reason that we saw a decline in cotton production in the southern United States. And so without these revenues earned from textile exports, Japan might have required a greater degree of foreign investment and might have wound up like some of the colonies in what we call the Third World today. Japanese women received few rewards for these contributions, however. For example, in 1900, new regulations prohibited women from joining political organizations or even attending public meetings. And by 1905, a group of independent women petitioned the Japanese government to rescind this restriction. And although this was not actually repealed until 1922, 2 years after women gained the right to vote in the United States, a call for women's rights were increasingly heard. Now, far from escaping imperialism, Japan actually participated in it. In joining the imperialist club, traditionally, Japan had not been an expansionist country. They had been divided for so many years and fighting amongst themselves for so long. They united briefly under the Tokugawa shogunate, but the real beginning of Japanese nationalism starts with this Meiji Restoration. And so as the Japanese began to emulate the Western style of society, the Western style of economy, the Western side of politics, they also began to adopt the Western aspect of aggressive foreign policy. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by this. Many Japanese by this time have gone and studied in Western countries. They have brought in Western military advisors. And so much of the culture at this time was wrapped around the idea of expansion. You know, the United States had expanded into the western part of our country, had conquered and took half of Mexico, had expanded aggressively throughout our spheres of influence. And so Japan is going to seek to do the same as well. The Japanese felt particularly vulnerable in terms of world economics. Their territory is small. I mean, if you compare Japan to China or Japan to the United States, yes, they are much smaller. Yet they are densely populated, though lacking in resources. Japan has as many people as the United States do today. Yet they are far smaller. So very densely populated, lacking in resources. And so there's no great outlet for expansion. You know, if our population grows and it becomes too crowded here, it's not hard to find a remote area with cheap land. You know, if you feel too crowded here and you don't want to leave the southeast, there are more remote places you can live where land is cheaper and you can be let well enough alone. Not so in Japan. And so Japan is going to adopt an aggressive foreign policy. Western nations had amassed great wealth and power, not only because of their democratic systems of government, not only because of their education systems, but also because of their colonies. Now, Japan began their program of territorial expansion close to home. For example, in 1874, after a brief conflict with China, Japan was able to claim rulership over the Ryukyu Islands. These had long been part of the Chinese Empire. 2 years later, Japanese naval forces pressured Korea to open up their ports to Japanese commerce. Not the same as a colony, but it is a controlled type of commerce where they forced their markets open. And during the 1800s, Korea wound up following Japan's example and attempted to isolate itself from outside contact. They would have limited contacts with China, but otherwise they hoped to remain on their own. For example, missionaries to Korea were often persecuted, but mainly Korea's problems were internal. For example, in the 1860s, a peasant revolt inspired from China caused considerable devastation before being put down. And then in the years to follow, the Yi dynasty tried to strengthen the country by returning its traditional values and by fending off outside intrusion. But we begin to see high degrees of poverty and corruption remain rampant throughout Korea. In fact, a United States fleet attempted to open up Korea to trade in 1871, but it was actually driven off violently. Yet, Korea's most persistent suitor or country seeking trading rights was Japan. Japan was determined to bring an end to Korea's dependency status on China and determined to help Korea modernize along the same lines as Japan had. By 1876, Korea agreed to open 3 different trading ports to Japanese commerce in return for recognition of Korean political independence. And this did put an end to the Japanese-Korean rivalry. When a new peasant rebellion broke out in Korea in 1894, China and Japan actually intervened on opposite sides. And during this war, the Japanese Navy destroyed the Chinese fleet and seized forcibly the Manchurian city at Port Arthur. And so the treaty that was reached, the Chinese were forced to recognize the independence of Korea, and they were forced to give over Taiwan and the Lidong Peninsula with its naval base at Port Arthur to Japan. Now, shortly after, pressure from European powers, in particular Russia, the Japanese are going to return to the Lidong Peninsula to China, but in the early 20th century they were back on the offensive. In fact, rivalry with Russia over influence in Korea created the Russo-Japanese War of the late 1800s. And during this war, Japan is going to kick Russia's butt and effectively take over Manchuria. Actually, Teddy Roosevelt would negotiate the treaty in this victory over Russia from Japan. And in later interviews, we found out that Japan considered this the beginning of a 1,000-year-long campaign to eventually expand its influence across the globe. So if you're a fan of World War II or you studied that, many people consider the Russo-Japanese War the first actions in that conflict. During the next few years, the Japanese consolidated their position in northeastern Asia. They went on to annex Korea in 1908, and while the Koreans protested, the Japanese conquered and put down any rebellions in Korea. The United States was actually the first to recognize the annexation in return for Tokyo's declaration of respect for U.S. authority in the Philippines. We had conquered the Philippines in 1898 in the Spanish-American War, and in return for Japan saying, okay, United States, you can have the Philippines, that can be your base, that can be your trading harbors, if you will, we agreed to recognize Japan's control over Korea. We said, whatever, you can have Korea. Ironic that we would later fight the Korean War just a few years afterwards. In 1908, the United States recognized Japan's interests in the region in return for Japan's acceptance of the principles of the open door policy that we had talked about last week. But mutual suspicion between these two countries was growing, sparked in part by U.S. efforts to restrict immigration from Asian countries. Now, Japanese adoption of European models. Western technology and ideas that had entered Japan in the second half of the 19th century were greatly altered Japanese culture. We can see this in literature. For example, the new literature, Japanese authors began translating and imitating Western styles. Japanese poets began to use Western styles such as symbolism, Dadaism, surrealism, and while, yes, traditional poetry was still composed. Japanese invited Western technicians, engineers, architects, and artists from all over Europe and the United States to teach their students how to create art, how to create technical projects, to engineer. Japanese architects and artists created huge buildings of steel. We begin to see some of the very first Japanese skyscrapers come up in the late 1800s. And this cultural exchange also went the other way. Japanese artists and craftsmen and creating everything from porcelain to textiles to fans to woodblock prints. These also became very popular throughout Europe and North America. And in fact, we see it, the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, and I'll close here, at the initial period of this mass absorption of Western art, there was kind of a counter-reaction as many artists tried to return to more traditional techniques. But while some artists attempted to synthesize native and foreign techniques, many more found inspiration in the old traditions. The Meiji Restoration, a revolution from above. Incomplete transformation. Japan's transformation from a feudal agrarian society to an industrializing, technologically advanced society in little more than half a century has frequently been described by outside observers in almost miraculous terms. Some historians have questioned this characterization, pointing out that the achievements of the Meiji leaders were spotty. In Japan's emergence as a modern state, the Canadian historian E. H. Norman lamented that the Meiji Restoration was a, quote, incomplete revolution because it did not end the economic and social inequities of feudal society or enable the common people to participate fully in the governing process. Although the Genro were enlightened in many respects, they were also despotic and elitist, and the distribution of wealth remained as unequal as it had been under the old feudal system. Moreover, Japan's transformation into a major industrial nation was by no means complete by the beginning of the new century. Until at least the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the majority of manufactured goods were produced by traditional cottage industries rather than by modern factories. The integration of the Japanese economy into the global marketplace was also limited, and foreign investment played a much smaller role than in most comparable economies in the West. Tremendous success story. These criticisms are persuasive, although most of them could be applied to most other societies going through the early stages of industrialization. In any event, from an economic perspective, the Meiji Restoration was certainly one of the great success stories of modern times. Not only did the Meiji leaders put Japan firmly on the path to economic and political development, but they also managed to remove the unequal treaty provisions that had been imposed at mid-century. Japanese achievements are especially impressive when compared with the difficulties experienced by China, which was not only unable to bring about significant changes in its traditional society, but had not even reached a consensus on the need for doing so. Japan's achievements more closely resemble those of Europe, but whereas the West needed a century and a half to achieve significant industrial development, the Japanese realized it in 40 years. One of the distinctive features of Japan's transition from a traditional to a modern society was that it took place for the most part without violence, or the kind of social political revolution that occurred in so many other countries. The Meiji Restoration, which began the process, has been called a revolution from above, a comprehensive restructuring of Japanese society by its own ruling group. What explains Japanese uniqueness? Aristocratic and capitalist elites, both ready for change. The differences between the Japanese response to the West and the responses of China and many other nations in the region have sparked considerable debate among students of comparative history. In this and previous chapters, we have already discussed some of the reasons why China, along with most other countries in Asia and Africa, had not begun to enter an industrial revolution of its own by the end of the 19th century. The puzzle then becomes, why was Japan apparently uniquely positioned to make the transition to an advanced industrial economy? A number of explanations have been offered. Some argued that Japan's success was partly due to good fortune. Lacking abundant natural resources, it was exposed to less pressure from the West than many of its neighbors. That argument is problematic, however, and would probably not have been accepted by Japanese observers at the time. Nor does it explain why nations under considerably less pressure, such as Laos and Nepal, did not advance even more quickly. All in all, the luck hypothesis is not very persuasive. Some explanations have already been suggested in this book. Japan's unique geographic position was certainly a factor. China, a continental nation with a heterogeneous ethnic composition, was distinguished from its neighbors by its Confucian culture. By contrast, Japan was an island nation, ethnically and linguistically homogeneous, and had never been conquered. Unlike the Chinese and many other peoples in the region, the Japanese had little to fear from cultural change in terms of its effect on their national identity. The fact that the emperor, the living symbol of the nation, had adopted change ensured that his subjects could follow in his footsteps without fear. In addition, a number of other factors have played a role. Japanese values, with their emphasis on practicality and military achievement, may have contributed. Finally, the Meiji also benefited from the fact that the pace of urbanization and commercial and industrial development had already begun to quicken under the Tokugawa. Having already lost their traditional feudal role and much of the revenue from their estates, the Japanese aristocracy, daimyo, and samurai alike could discard sword and kimono and don modern military uniforms or Western business suits and still feel comfortable in both worlds. Whatever the case, as the historian W.G. Beasley has noted, the Meiji Restoration was possible because aristocratic and capitalist elements managed to work together to bring about drastic change. Japan, it was said, was ripe for change, and nothing could have been more suitable as an antidote for the collapsing old system than the Western emphasis on wealth and power. It was a classic example of challenge and response. The fusion of East and West. The final product was an amalgam of old and new, Japanese and foreign, forming a new civilization that was uniquely Japanese. There were some undesirable consequences, however. Because Meiji politics was essentially despotic, Japanese leaders were able to fuse key traditional elements such as the warrior ethic and the concept of feudal loyalty with the dynamics of modern industrial capitalism to create a state totally dedicated to the possession of material wealth and national power. This combination of kokutai and capitalism, which one scholar has described as a form of Asian fascism, was highly effective but explosive in its international manifestation. Like modern Germany, which also entered the industrial age directly from feudalism, Japan engaged in a policy of repression at home and expansion abroad to achieve its national objectives. In Japan, as in Germany, it took defeat in war to disconnect the drive for national development from the feudal ethic and bring about the transformation to a pluralistic society dedicated to living in peace and cooperation with its neighbors.